The market square was louder than Kalen expected, and in one single breath, he lost sight of the only face he knew. One moment his small hand was wrapped around Greta's fingers, and the next, a wave of shoulders and baskets and shouting merchants swallowed her whole. He spun in a circle, his heart hammering so hard it hurt his chest, and every face around him belonged to someone he did not recognize. Somewhere behind him, a horse snorted and stamped its feet, and the sound made him flinch and run. He was 5 years old, and he was the son of the Alpha King, but none of that mattered in this moment. He was only a boy who could not find the one person who was supposed to be holding his hand. His small boots carried him between two stalls piled high with dried herbs, and he nearly collided with a woman carrying a basket of bread. She caught his shoulder gently to steady him, but he twisted away before she could speak, his eyes darting past her, searching, and finding nothing familiar. Panic climbed up his throat like something alive. Then he saw her. She was standing near the edge of the square, half turned away, dressed in a plain gray cloak that did nothing to draw attention to her. She had soft brown hair pulled back loosely, and there was something quiet about the way she stood, like she was trying very hard not to be noticed by anyone. Kalen did not know her. He did not know her name, or her face, or anything about her at all. But in that moment, his small body did not care about names. He ran to her, and grabbed her hand with both of his, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned pale, and he looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. "Mother," he said, breathless. "I lost you. I was so scared." The word left his mouth, before his mind could catch up to it, before he even understood what he had said. It simply came out, the way instinct sometimes speaks faster than thought. The woman froze completely. Her lips parted as if to correct him, but no sound came out. She looked down at the small boy holding her hand like his life depended on it. His cheeks flushed, his eyes wet with unshed tears, and something in her chest twisted painfully. She did not know this child. She had never seen him before in her life. And yet he was looking up at her the way a child looks at someone who is supposed to keep him safe. "I am not," she began, but stopped when she felt his grip tighten even further, as though he sensed she might pull away, and the fear of that alone was too much for him to bear. She crouched down instead, lowering herself to his height, her cloak pooling around her knees on the dusty ground. Up close, she could see how young he truly was, how his lower lip trembled, how his small chest rose and fell too quickly. "You are safe now," she said softly, because whatever she was or was not to him, that much was true. "Just breathe. You are safe." It was in that exact moment that the crowd near the square's entrance parted, not out of courtesy, but out of instinct, the way a pack of animals parts for something larger and more dangerous than themselves. Alpha King Draven stepped through the gap, his dark eyes scanning the square with the barely restrained fury of a father who had just been told his son was missing. He found him within seconds. His eyes locked onto the small figure crouched beside a stranger in a gray cloak, and his stride toward them was fast enough that several nearby vendors stepped back out of his path without being asked. "Kalen." His voice was low, controlled, but underneath it ran something sharper, something close to relief, mixed with anger. He reached his son in 3 long strides and dropped to one knee, his large hands settling on the boy's shoulders, checking him over as if searching for injuries. "Father." Kalen's voice cracked with the kind of relief only children can express so openly. He let go of the woman's hand at last, and threw both arms around his father's neck instead. "I got lost. I could not find Greta. I was so scared, Father." Draven held him close for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes closed briefly, as though gathering himself. When he opened them again, they landed on the woman still crouched nearby, who had risen halfway to her feet, clearly unsure whether to stay or vanish into the crowd the way she had clearly wanted to before any of this happened. "She was scared too," Kalen said suddenly, pulling back just enough to look between his father and the stranger. "I called her mother. I did not mean to, it just happened." The words hit the air like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward in silence. Every guard standing nearby went still. Every merchant who had been pretending not to listen suddenly stopped pretending. The pack had not heard the word mother spoken near their king's son in 3 years, not since the day his true mother had been laid to rest beneath the old oak trees behind the pack house. Everyone braced for the reaction they expected. Grief, correction, perhaps even anger at the stranger, for allowing the mistake to happen at all. Instead, Draven simply looked at her. He rose slowly to his full height. Kaelin still held against his hip, though the boy was really too old to be carried that way, and his dark eyes studied the woman with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet somehow made it impossible to do so. "I am sorry," she said quickly, her voice steady despite the way her pulse was racing. "I did not correct him right away. I did not want to frighten him further while he was already so upset. I meant no disrespect, my king." Draven said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that Corwin, his oldest advisor, who had hurried through the crowd behind him, opened his mouth to smooth over the moment, with some practiced words about misunderstandings and forgiveness. But Draven lifted one hand slightly, and Corwin's mouth closed again without a single word spoken. "What is your name?" Draven finally asked. "Elara," she answered, straightening her spine as if bracing for judgment. "I am new to the territory. I did not mean to cause any trouble." "You did not cause trouble," Draven said, his voice quiet but firm enough to carry. "You kept my son calm when he could not find anyone else. That is not trouble. That is kindness." Elara blinked, clearly not expecting that response. Around them, the whispers had already begun, low murmurs passing from one vendor to another, from one guard to the next, spreading through the square faster than any of them could stop it. The king's silence, more than any words he could have spoken, was the loudest thing anyone had heard all season. Kaelin, oblivious to the weight of what had just happened, wriggled slightly in his father's arms, looking back toward Elara with a small, hopeful smile forming on his face, the first genuine smile several of the older guards had seen from the boy in longer than they could easily remember. "Will she come with us?" he asked, looking up at his father with wide, expectant eyes. "I do not want her to be lost too." Draven's expression did not change, but something in his eyes flickered, something unreadable, even to those who had known him for years. He looked at Elara again, taking in the plain cloak, the tired lines beneath her eyes that spoke of exhaustion older than a single day, the way she stood as though ready to disappear the moment she was given permission. "Come with us," he said finally, not as a request, though his tone held none of the sharpness his advisors were used to hearing in his commands. "Just until my son is settled. It is the least I owe you." Elara hesitated, glancing toward the crowd, toward the path that led away from the square and back toward whatever quiet corner of the territory she had been trying to stay hidden in. Every instinct in her body told her to decline, to bow politely, and vanish before anyone asked too many questions about who she was or where she had come from. But Kaelin was still looking at her, his small hand reaching out slightly in her direction, as though some part of him was afraid that letting her walk away now meant losing something important all over again. "All right," she said softly, "just until he is settled." Draven gave a short nod, turned, and began walking back toward the pack house, with his son held securely against him, leaving Elara no choice but to follow a few steps behind, flanked now by two guards, who fell into step beside her, without a word of explanation. Corwin lingered a moment longer, watching the retreating figures with a frown creasing his weathered face. He had served Draven since before the king's marriage, before the birth of his son, before the loss that had turned the pack house into a place of long silences and closed doors. He had never once seen Draven allow a stranger this close, not without weeks of vetting, not without endless questions about loyalty and lineage. And yet here he was, walking beside her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The walk back through the territory felt longer than it should have. Elara kept her eyes forward, aware of every glance thrown her way by pack members, who paused their tasks to watch the small procession pass. She had spent months in this territory trying to remain invisible, trying to blend into the background of a life that was not truly hers, and now she was walking directly through its center, with two guards at her sides, and the king himself only a few paces ahead. Kaelin, meanwhile, had grown quiet in his father's arms, his earlier panic fading into simple, drowsy comfort now that the immediate danger had passed. But every so often, he would twist his head to check that Elara was still there, as though some part of him feared she might disappear the moment he stopped watching. By the time they reached the tall iron gates of the pack house, the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red. The grand stone building rose before them, imposing and quiet, its many windows catching the last of the daylight. Ilara stopped just inside the gates, suddenly acutely aware of how out of place she looked among the polished stone and carved wood of the entrance hall. Servants moved past with quick, curious glances, none of them bold enough to ask questions aloud, though their eyes spoke volumes. Draven finally set Kaelin down, though the boy immediately reached for Ilara's hand again, small fingers curling around hers with the same trust he had shown in the square. She did not pull away this time. "He should rest," Draven said, addressing a nearby servant, without looking away from his son. "Have food brought to his room, and prepare a guest chamber." The servant's eyes flicked briefly toward Ilara, before she bowed and hurried off to follow the order. Ilara opened her mouth to protest, to explain that she had only meant to help calm the boy in the square, that she had no intention of staying within the walls of the pack house itself. But the words caught in her throat when she saw the way Kaelin was looking up at her, his small face still pale from the fright of the afternoon. "Please," he said quietly, "just for a little while." She looked to Draven, expecting him to intervene, to gently explain to his son that strangers did not simply stay the night in a king's home, no matter how comforting they had been for an afternoon. But Draven said nothing at all. He merely watched the two of them with that same unreadable expression from before, his silence somehow heavier and more telling than any command he might have given. And so, against every instinct that told her to run, Ilara found herself being led deeper into the pack house, her hand still held in the small, trusting grip of a boy who was not her son, following a king who had not yet spoken a single word to explain why he was allowing any of this to happen at all. Behind them, the great doors of the pack house closed with a heavy, final sound, sealing her inside a world she had spent months trying desperately to avoid. The guest chamber they gave her was larger than any room she had lived in since arriving in the territory. A wide window overlooked the eastern gardens, and a fire had already been lit in the hearth by the time she stepped inside, though she had said nothing about being cold. She stood near the doorway for a long moment, unwilling to sit on the neatly made bed or touch anything in the room, as though claiming even a small space for herself might make the whole strange afternoon feel permanent. A soft knock came at her door before she could settle her thoughts. When she opened it, a young servant stood there holding a tray of food, her eyes curious but polite. "The king asked that you join him, and the young master for supper," the servant said, "if you are willing." Ilara considered refusing. It would have been easy to claim exhaustion, to ask instead for a quiet meal, alone in this room, before slipping away at first light, disappearing back into the ordinary life she had built for herself in a small cottage at the edge of the territory. But the memory of Kaelin's face, the way his small hand had trembled in hers, kept her from saying the words. "I will come," she said instead. The dining hall was smaller than she expected, clearly a private space rather than the grand hall used for pack gatherings. A long table sat near tall windows, set for 3, though it looked as though it had been designed to hold far more guests in years past. Draven was already seated at the head of the table when she entered, and Kaelin sat close beside him, swinging his legs beneath his chair, with the restless energy of a child who had recovered quickly from his earlier fright. "You came," Kaelin said brightly, sitting up straighter when he saw her. "I did," she answered, taking the seat that had clearly been left for her, directly across from the boy. Draven said little throughout the first part of the meal, though his eyes moved between his son and Ilara, often enough that she felt the weight of his attention, even when he was not speaking. Kaelin filled the silence easily, chattering about a wooden horse he had been carving, with the help of one of the stable hands, about a bird's nest he had found near the training yard, about anything and everything a 5-year-old found worth sharing. Ilara found herself relaxing despite her better judgment, answering his questions, asking a few of her own, and even laughing softly once when he described in great detail how he had tried to teach the bird's nest to sing, apparently under the belief that the eggs inside could somehow be convinced to make music before they hatched. It was strange to feel this at ease inside walls she had never wanted to enter, stranger still to notice that Draven, despite his silence, seemed to be watching the exchange with something close to relief written across his features, though he was careful never to let it show for more than a passing moment. After the meal, a nursemaid arrived to take Kaelin to bed, though the boy protested loudly, insisting he was not tired at all even as he yawned mid-sentence. He clung briefly to Ilara's sleeve, before allowing himself to be led away, glancing back twice to make sure she had not vanished the moment his back was turned. When the door closed behind them, the dining hall felt suddenly much larger and much quieter. "You did not have to allow any of this," Alara said carefully, breaking the silence first, because she could not bear to sit in it any longer. "I understand this must look strange to your pack. A king inviting a stranger to dine with his son." Draven leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with the same unreadable expression he had worn since the square. "My son has not smiled the way he smiled tonight in a very long time," he said finally, "not since his mother passed." The words settled heavily in the room. Alara did not know how to respond to something so raw and so unexpected, spoken so plainly by a man she had assumed would guard his grief far more carefully. "I am not trying to replace anyone," she said quietly. "I want you to understand that what happened in the square was a mistake. A child's mistake, born of fear. I never intended for it to become anything more than that." "I know," Draven said, and yet, he did not finish the sentence, and she did not ask him to. Something about the way he left the words hanging in the air felt deliberate, as though he himself did not fully understand what he meant to say next, or perhaps understood it too well, and was not yet ready to speak it aloud. "I should return home tonight," Alara said after a moment, rising slightly from her chair. "It grows late, and I have already imposed on your household enough for one day." "Stay the night," Draven said, and though his tone remained even, there was something in it that was not quite a command and not quite a request either. "The roads are not safe after dark, and my son will ask for you again in the morning if you are not here." Alara hesitated, weighing the wisdom of staying against every instinct that told her to leave while she still could, but exhaustion, both from the day's events and from months of carefully guarded solitude, finally won out over caution. "Just for tonight," she said. "Just for tonight," Draven agreed, though something in his eyes suggested he did not entirely believe his own words either. She returned to the guest chamber not long after, the fire still burning low in the hearth, and sat by the window for a long while before finally allowing herself to rest. Sleep did not come easily. Her mind kept circling back to the boy's trusting grip on her hand, to the king's strange, watchful silence, to the whispers she had heard trailing behind them as they walked through the territory earlier that day. She had come to this territory to disappear, to build a quiet life far removed from the one she had left behind. She had not expected, not even for a moment, to find herself standing inside the walls of the pack house, sharing a meal with its king and his grieving son, wondering what exactly she had stumbled into. Elsewhere in the pack house, in a private study lined with old books and maps of the territory, Corwin stood before Draven's desk, his expression carefully neutral, though his words carried clear concern. "My king, I do not question your judgment," he began carefully, "but the pack is already talking. A stranger, invited into your home after a single afternoon. Your son calling her by a name that belongs to someone else. People will ask questions, and questions left unanswered tend to grow into something far more dangerous than curiosity." Draven did not look up from the papers before him immediately. When he finally did, his expression was calm, though something beneath it suggested he had been expecting this conversation the moment he allowed Alara through the gates. "Let them ask," he said simply. "My king. My son has not laughed like that in 3 years, Corwin." Draven's voice remained level, but there was an edge beneath it now, one that made the older man pause. 3 years of silence in this house, 3 years of watching him flinch whenever someone mentions his mother, and tonight, for the first time, he laughed at supper as though nothing was wrong in the world. Corwin said nothing for a long moment, his sharp eyes studying his king carefully. "You believe there is something more to this woman than a chance encounter in the market." It was not quite a question, but Draven answered it as though it were. "I do not know what I believe yet," he said. "But I know what I saw, and I am not willing to close a door simply because it opened in a way none of us expected." "And if she is not what she appears?" Corwin pressed. "You know nothing of her past, my king. She arrived in this territory only months ago, with no family, no pack ties, no history that anyone can account for. That alone should give us pause." Draven's jaw tightened slightly at that, though whether from irritation or from some private thought of his own, Corwin could not easily tell. "Then we will learn who she is," Draven said finally, quietly, without frightening her away, "before we understand what brought her here in the first place." Corwin bowed his head slightly, accepting the order even if his own doubts remained unresolved. As you wish, my king. I will make inquiries. Discreetly, Draven added, his tone leaving no room for argument. My son has already lost one person he loved. I will not risk frightening away someone who has, however briefly, brought some light back into this house. Not until I understand exactly what we are dealing with. Corwin left the study without further protest, though the frown he wore as he walked down the long corridor suggested his concerns were far from settled. Behind him, Draven remained at his desk long after the door had closed, staring at nothing in particular, his thoughts circling back again and again to the image of his son's face lit up with genuine, unguarded joy for the first time in years. Whatever answers Corwin's inquiries might eventually bring, Draven found himself unwilling, even now, to regret the silence he had chosen in the square that afternoon. Something had shifted within the walls of his home tonight, something fragile and uncertain, and he was not ready to let it slip away simply because it did not fit neatly into the expectations of his pack. Upstairs, in the guest chamber overlooking the eastern gardens, Elara finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that a single afternoon's mistake had already set into motion questions that would follow her far beyond the walls she had hoped would remain nothing more than a temporary shelter for one quiet, uncertain night. Morning came with pale light and the sound of birds in the garden below, and Elara woke with a start, momentarily forgetting where she was. The unfamiliar ceiling above her, the soft weight of blankets far finer than any she owned, the distant murmur of servants moving through the halls, all of it reminded her sharply that she had not, in fact, dreamed the previous day. She dressed quickly, intending to slip away before breakfast, before anyone had the chance to ask her to stay another hour longer than she had already agreed to. But when she opened her door, Kalen was sitting on the floor of the corridor just outside, his small legs crossed, clearly having been waiting for some time. "You did not leave," he said, relief plain on his face, as he scrambled to his feet. "I was only just waking," Elara said gently, though her plan to disappear quietly had already begun crumbling the moment she saw him there. "Father said I could show you the garden before you go," Kalen said, grabbing her hand without waiting for her agreement, tugging her toward the staircase with the single-minded determination only a child possesses. "There is a pond with fish, real fish. I named one of them Pebble." She allowed herself to be led, telling herself this was simply one more kindness before she finally returned to her own quiet life, though some part of her recognized how easily she was allowing herself to be pulled deeper into a world that was not hers to belong to. The garden was larger than she expected, filled with neatly trimmed hedges and blooming flowers that spoke of careful, constant tending. Kalen led her straight to the small pond at its center, pointing excitedly at a flash of orange beneath the surface. "That is Pebble," he announced proudly. "He is the fastest one." Elara crouched beside the pond, watching the fish dart between lily pads, and found herself smiling, despite everything weighing on her mind. There was something disarming about the boy's easy joy, something that made the complicated tangle of her own past feel, for just a moment, a little further away. "Do you like it here?" Kalen asked suddenly, tilting his head to look at her. "It is a beautiful garden," she answered carefully, aware of how the question could be interpreted more broadly than he perhaps intended. "I mean, do you like it here?" he pressed, undeterred. "With us. Father does not usually let people stay. Not since Mother." The mention of his mother, spoken so plainly and without hesitation, caught Elara off guard. She had assumed, from the careful silences of the household staff, that the subject was one nobody dared bring up around the boy at all. "What was she like?" Elara asked softly, unsure if the question crossed a line she should not cross, but curious despite herself. Kalen's expression grew thoughtful, the kind of careful thinking children do when trying to recall something important. "She sang to me," he said finally. "Every night. I do not remember her voice very well anymore. Father does not sing. Nobody sings anymore." The simple honesty in his words struck Elara harder than she expected. She had lost people too, in her own way, though the nature of her losses was different, more complicated, tangled up in fear rather than simple grief. But the ache of missing someone, of reaching for a memory that had begun to fade despite every effort to hold on to it, was something she understood completely. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "That must be very hard." Kalen shrugged in the particular way children shrug off things too large for them to fully carry, and turned his attention back to the fish, pointing out another one he claimed was named Rock, apparently in keeping with some naming tradition only he understood. They stayed by the pond a while longer, until the sound of footsteps on the garden path drew both their attention. Draven approached, dressed more formally than the previous evening, his expression composed though his eyes softened slightly at the sight of his son, crouched happily beside the water. "Corwin is asking for you," he said to Kalen, not unkindly. "Your lessons begin soon." Kalen groaned dramatically, the way only a young child protesting schoolwork can manage, but rose obediently after a moment, giving Alara's hand one last squeeze before hurrying off toward the house, already calling out something about wanting to learn how fish breathed underwater. That left Alara alone with Draven for the first time since the previous night, standing beside the quiet pond with the morning sun casting long shadows across the garden path. He asked about his mother, Alara said, deciding honesty was safer than pretending the conversation had not happened. "I hope I did not overstep by answering him." "You did not," Draven said. "It is more than he has offered most people in this house in a long while." There was a pause between them, filled only by the soft ripple of water and the distant sound of the pack house, waking fully into its morning routine. "I should return home today," Alara said finally, forcing the words out before her resolve could weaken further. "I have already stayed longer than I intended, and I do not wish to cause further talk among your people." "There will be talk regardless," Draven said, his tone matter-of-fact rather than dismissive. "But I understand. If you wish to leave, I will have an escort arranged for you." The offer, simple and practical as it was, still surprised her slightly. She had expected some resistance, perhaps even from the boy himself once he learned she intended to go, but Draven simply nodded, as though respecting her wish to leave came naturally to him despite whatever else he might have wanted to say. "Thank you," she said, "for your hospitality, and for not correcting him yesterday, in front of everyone. It could not have been easy to hear." Draven was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the direction his son had disappeared, before finally returning to her. "There are things a father learns to carry silently," he said. "Grief does not always need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could." The weight of his words lingered in the air between them, heavier than anything spoken the previous evening. Alara found herself unable to look away from him, caught somewhere between the careful distance she had maintained since arriving in the territory, and something new, stirring quietly beneath it, something she was not yet ready to name. "I hope your son continues to heal," she said finally, breaking the moment before it could stretch any further. "He deserves happiness, whatever form it comes in." "So do you," Draven said simply, and though the words were plain, something in the way he said them made her breath catch slightly. Before she could respond, a servant approached, with news that her escort was ready, and the moment passed as quickly as it had arrived. Alara said her goodbyes quickly after that, offering Kalen a promise she was not entirely certain she should have made when he found her near the front gates and begged her, with tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, to visit again soon. The ride back to her small cottage at the edge of the territory felt strange after the grandeur of the pack house, the quiet familiarity of her modest home suddenly feeling both like relief and like something slightly hollow after the fullness of the previous day. She spent the following hours trying to settle back into her usual routine, tending to the small garden behind her cottage, mending a torn hem, fetching water from the nearby stream, but her thoughts kept drifting back, unwillingly, to the boy's trusting grip on her hand, to the king's quiet, watchful silence, to words spoken beside a fish pond that seemed to carry far more meaning than their simplicity suggested. She told herself firmly that this had been a single strange afternoon, a kindness, offered and received, nothing more. She had built this quiet life for herself precisely to avoid entanglements, precisely to avoid being noticed by anyone who might ask too many questions about who she was, or where she had come from. And yet, as the sun began to set and she sat alone by her small hearth, she found herself wondering, despite every warning instinct urging her otherwise, whether Kalen's promise of a visit would truly be the last time she saw either the boy or his father again. She did not have to wonder long. 3 days later, a knock came at her cottage door, and when she opened it, she found Kalen standing there with an escort of 2 guards a respectful distance behind him, His small face lit up with the same hopeful excitement she remembered from the garden. "Father said I could visit," he announced proudly, as though this alone explained everything. "I brought Pebble's picture. I drew it myself." Behind him, further down the path, Draven stood waiting, his expression carefully composed, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was bracing for whatever her reaction might be to this unannounced visit. Alara looked between the boy's eager face and the king's watchful patience, and felt the careful walls she had built around her quiet, hidden life begin, slowly and unmistakably, to shift. She invited them in, though her small cottage held little to offer a king and his son, beyond simple tea and a plate of bread she had baked that morning. Kalen did not seem to mind at all, settling himself at her modest table and spreading out his drawing of Pebble the fish with great ceremony, explaining in careful detail why he had chosen orange for the scales, and why the pond in his drawing had far more lily pads than the real one actually contained. Draven remained standing near the doorway at first, his eyes moving slowly around the small space, taking in the modest furniture, the single window, the carefully mended curtains that spoke of someone living simply and without excess. There was nothing in the cottage that hinted at wealth or status, nothing that explained who this woman truly was, or where she had come from, before arriving in his territory. "You live here alone," he said finally, not quite a question. "I do," Alara answered, pouring tea into two mismatched cups before realizing she did not own a third, and quickly fetching an old wooden mug instead. "It suits me well enough." "No family nearby?" he asked, watching her carefully as he accepted the offered cup. Alara's hands stilled briefly over the teapot before she continued pouring, a small hesitation that did not escape his notice. "No family," she said simply. "Not anymore." She did not elaborate further, and Draven, to his credit, did not push the matter, though the careful way he studied her afterward suggested he had noted the evasion and filed it away for later thought. The visit stretched into the afternoon, filled mostly with Kalen's endless chatter and the small, easy laughter that seemed to come more naturally to him with each passing day. Alara found herself relaxing again, despite her earlier resolve to keep her distance, answering the boy's questions about her small garden, showing him how to identify which herbs were safe to nibble on and which were better left untouched, laughing softly when he declared, with great seriousness, that he intended to grow his own garden one day, entirely devoted to growing more fish for Pebble to have company. It was only after Kalen had wandered outside to examine a beetle he had spotted near the garden path, under the watchful eye of one of the guards, that Draven finally spoke again, his voice lower now that they were alone. "You are hiding from something," he said, not unkindly, but with the directness of a man who had spent years learning to read the truth beneath careful words. "I do not ask to pry into matters that are not mine to know. But I would be a poor protector of my son if I did not at least understand whether that hiding brings danger anywhere near him." Alara's grip tightened slightly around her cup, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this question would come eventually. She had simply hoped it would come later, once she had already found a way to gently distance herself from this family, before the truth of her past could ever reach them. "I left somewhere I should never have stayed as long as I did," she said finally, choosing her words with great care. "Somewhere that was not safe for me. I do not believe that danger has followed me here, but I understand your concern. If I believed for even a moment that my presence put your son at risk, I would leave this territory entirely without hesitation." Draven studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers as though trying to gauge the full truth behind her careful, guarded words. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly. Alara looked away, toward the window, where she could see Kalen crouched in the grass, completely absorbed in his examination of the beetle, utterly unaware of the conversation happening inside. "I do not wish to speak of it," she said. "Not yet, perhaps not ever. I hope you can understand that some wounds are easier carried in silence." Something shifted in Draven's expression at that, a flicker of recognition passing across his features. "I understand that better than you might expect," he said, his voice softer now. "I will not press you further, but know that if that danger ever does find its way to this territory, you are not without protection here." The offer, quiet and unexpected as it was, settled something uneasy in Alara's chest, though it also frightened her in ways she could not fully explain. She had spent months building a life entirely around the principle of remaining unnoticed, of never allowing herself to become important enough to anyone that her past might feel compelled to find her again. And here was a king, offering her protection she had not asked for, protection that could only draw more attention to her presence in his territory rather than less. "Thank you," she said finally, because there was little else to say to such an offer. "I hope it never comes to that." They did not speak further of it that day, though the conversation lingered between them even as Kaelin returned inside, breathless with excitement over some detail of the beetle's markings, effectively ending any further discussion of darker matters. The visit continued pleasantly enough after that, until the afternoon light began to fade, and Draven announced it was time for them to return to the pack house before evening fully settled in. Kaelin hugged her tightly before leaving, extracting another promise of a future visit, though this time Ilara made sure to phrase her agreement more carefully, aware now of just how easily these visits could become expected rather than occasional. That night, alone again in her quiet cottage, Ilara sat by her small hearth long after the fire had burned low, her thoughts circling back to the life she had left behind. She thought of the territory she had fled months earlier, of the Alpha whose control over her had grown more suffocating with each passing season, of the careful, desperate plan that had finally allowed her to slip away unnoticed in the dead of night, leaving behind everything she had once known. She had told herself, upon arriving in this new territory, that she would remain invisible, unremarkable, nothing more than a quiet presence at the edges of a community that would never think to look twice at her. She had not expected a lost, frightened child to grab her hand in a crowded market and unknowingly unravel months of careful, deliberate anonymity. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and she rose cautiously, her heart beginning to race, before she reminded herself that Draven's guards had already escorted the boy and his father safely back to the pack house hours earlier. When she opened the door, she found a young pack member standing there, a woman perhaps a few years younger than herself, holding a small basket of preserves. "I am Ivy," the woman said, offering a warm smile. "I heard the young master visited you today. I thought I would bring something by, since you are new to the territory, and I imagine it has been difficult settling in alone." Ilara accepted the basket with genuine surprise, unaccustomed to such simple, unprompted kindness from someone she had never met. "That is very thoughtful of you," she said. "Thank you." Ivy lingered a moment at the doorway, her expression curious but friendly rather than probing. "The whole territory is talking about you, you know," she said, not unkindly. "The king, inviting a stranger into his home, his son calling you by a name he has not spoken aloud in years. People are curious, that is all. Not everyone means harm by it." "I understand their curiosity," Ilara said carefully. "I only hope it does not become something more complicated than that." "For what it is worth," Ivy said, "I think it is good, whatever it is. That boy has been quiet for far too long. And the king, well, he has carried more than any man should have to carry alone, for as long as I have known him." She left shortly after, leaving Ilara standing in her doorway with the basket of preserves in her hands, watching the last light of evening fade over the quiet path leading back toward the heart of the territory. She thought of Ivy's words, of the whispers she imagined circulating through the pack house and beyond, of the danger she had spent months trying to avoid drawing back toward herself simply by existing too visibly. Far beyond the borders of this territory, in a place Ilara hoped never to think of again, a man named Garrick sat in a dimly lit study, listening carefully to a report brought to him by one of his most trusted trackers. The tracker spoke of rumors reaching neighboring territories, whispers of a woman who had appeared unexpectedly in the Alpha King's household, a woman whose description matched, with unsettling precision, someone Garrick had spent months searching for, without success. Garrick's expression remained calm as he listened, though something cold and calculating settled behind his eyes. He had not forgotten her. He had not forgiven the manner of her leaving, nor the humiliation her disappearance had cost him among his own people. "Confirm it," he said finally, once the tracker had finished speaking. "Quietly, I want to know exactly where she has hidden herself before I decide what to do about it." The tracker bowed and left without further question, leaving Garrick alone with his thoughts, a slow, patient smile forming on his face, as he considered, for the first time in months, that his search might finally be nearing its end. Weeks passed, and what had begun as a single unplanned visit slowly settled into something resembling routine. though nobody involved would have admitted to planning it that way. Kaelin visited the small cottage nearly twice a week now, always with an escort, always with some new small treasure to share. A smooth stone from the training yard, a drawing of the pond, a story about something he had learned during his lessons that he was eager to repeat in his own words. Alara found herself looking forward to these visits more than she was comfortable admitting, even to herself. There was something healing in watching the boy grow steadily lighter with each passing week, his laughter coming more easily, his questions growing bolder, his fear of losing sight of people he cared about slowly softening into simple trust. Dr. Milo, the pack's healer who had overseen Kaelin's care since the loss of his mother, noticed the change before anyone dared to speak of it openly. He mentioned it carefully to Draven one afternoon, while examining Kaelin after a minor scrape from the training yard. "He sleeps through the night now," Milo said, his tone thoughtful as he wrapped a bandage around the boy's knee. "He used to wake crying at least twice a week, calling for his mother. He has not done so in nearly a month." Draven, standing nearby with his arms crossed, said nothing immediately, though his eyes drifted toward the window, toward the direction of the small cottage at the edge of the territory, where his son had insisted on visiting again just that morning. "Whatever is happening," Milo continued carefully, "it is working in ways 3 years of careful handling never quite managed. I only say this because I know the pack has questions about the woman's presence here, and I think it is worth remembering what matters most in all of this." "I have not forgotten," Draven said quietly, "not for a moment." Milo studied him a moment longer, his sharp eyes noting something in his king's expression that went beyond simple concern for his son's well-being, though he was wise enough not to comment further on it directly. He finished tending to Kaelin's knee and sent the boy off to rest, leaving Draven alone with his thoughts once more. Corwin's inquiries, meanwhile, had turned up frustratingly little. Ilara's arrival in the territory months earlier had been quiet, unremarkable, the kind of arrival that drew no attention, precisely because it had been designed not to. She had settled in the small cottage, taken on modest work mending clothes and tending gardens for a handful of nearby families, and given no indication of any pack affiliation or history, beyond vague mentions of having traveled from somewhere further south. "There is nothing concerning in what I have found," Corwin admitted to Draven one evening, laying out the sparse details he had gathered. "But there is also nothing that explains her thoroughly either. It is as though she arrived from nowhere, with great care taken to ensure it stayed that way." "Perhaps that itself tells us something," Draven said, considering the information carefully. "A person running from something dangerous does not leave a trail behind them easily. That does not make her a threat, Corwin. It may simply make her someone who has already suffered enough." Corwin inclined his head slightly, though his expression remained troubled. "I only wish to protect this pack, my king, and your son." "As do I," Draven said, "which is why I have not stopped watching, even as I have chosen not to close the door on her presence here." Despite his careful reassurances to Corwin, Draven found himself thinking of Alara more often than he was entirely comfortable admitting, even to himself. It had been 3 years since he allowed himself to consider anyone beyond the narrow scope of his grief and his responsibilities as both father and king. 3 years of careful distance, of polite refusals to the occasional suggestions from well-meaning pack elders that perhaps it was time to consider companionship again for his own sake, as much as his son's. He had dismissed each suggestion easily enough, never tempted, never curious. And yet something about the quiet, guarded woman who had appeared so unexpectedly in the market square had unsettled that careful distance in ways he had not anticipated. He visited the cottage himself one afternoon, without Kaelin, under the simple pretense of ensuring her continued safety within the territory. Alara answered the door with visible surprise, quickly composing herself as she invited him in, though her eyes carried a wariness that had not fully faded even after weeks of visits. "Kaelin is with his tutor today," Draven explained, standing somewhat awkwardly near her small table. "I did not wish to intrude, but I found myself wanting to check that all was well with you." "All is well," Ilara said, though something in her tone suggested she was uncertain how to interpret his unexpected visit. "Your son has been a bright addition to my otherwise quiet days. I confess, I have grown fond of his company." "He speaks of you constantly," Draven admitted, a faint, rare smile touching his features. "More than he has spoken of anything in years. I find myself grateful, more than I know how to properly express, for whatever it is you have given him, simply by allowing these visits to continue." Elara felt heat rise to her cheeks at the sincerity in his words, unaccustomed to such open gratitude directed her way. "He has given me something as well," she admitted quietly. "I did not expect to find comfort in a child's company, given my own circumstances. But he has a way of making the world feel simpler than it truly is." They spoke for a while longer, the conversation drifting easily between simple topics. The coming change of season, a minor dispute among neighboring farmers that Draven had recently settled, a story Elara shared, about a particularly stubborn goat that had once escaped its pen 3 times in a single week during her childhood. It was, in many ways, an ordinary conversation between 2 people, slowly growing more comfortable in each other's presence. But beneath the ordinary surface of it, something else was building as well, something neither of them named aloud, though it lived quietly in the pauses between their words, in the way their eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary, in the careful, deliberate distance they each maintained, even as that distance grew thinner with each visit. As the visit drew to a close, Draven lingered near the doorway, a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I know you carry burdens you have chosen not to share," he said quietly. "I will not press you for them, but I want you to know that whatever brought you to this territory, whatever you left behind, you are welcome here. Not simply for my son's sake, for your own as well." Elara's breath caught slightly at the weight of his words, at the quiet sincerity behind them. "Thank you," she said softly, unsure what else could possibly capture the complicated swell of feeling his simple statement had stirred within her. He left shortly after, and Elara stood in her doorway long after he had disappeared down the path, her thoughts a tangled mixture of gratitude, unease, and something warmer she was not yet ready to examine too closely. Meanwhile, far from the quiet peace of that afternoon, Garrick's tracker returned with confirmation that had taken far longer to secure than expected, given the surprising discretion the Alpha King's household had maintained around the woman's presence. The tracker described the small cottage at the edge of the territory, the child who visited it so frequently, the careful protection quietly extended around a woman who, by all accounts, held no formal claim to any of it. Garrick listened with growing satisfaction, already turning over the possibilities in his mind. A king who had grown attached to a woman with no pack, no family, no claim to protection beyond his own personal will, was a king who might be persuaded, through the right pressures, to reconsider just how much he was willing to risk to keep her. "Prepare for travel," Garrick instructed his tracker. "I believe it is time I paid a visit to this territory myself." The tracker bowed and left to make the necessary arrangements, leaving Garrick alone, with a slow, deliberate satisfaction settling over him, the quiet certainty of a predator who believed, after months of patient searching, that he had finally found exactly where his prey had chosen to hide. Word of the king's growing attachment to Elara had, by now, spread well beyond the borders of his own territory, carried through the casual gossip of traveling merchants and the loose talk of guards stationed at border crossings who had no idea the information they shared so freely might reach dangerous ears. Within the packhouse itself, the whispers had grown bolder as well, no longer confined to hushed corners, but spoken more openly, among those who felt secure enough in their standing to voice their opinions aloud. Some among the pack elders expressed cautious approval, pleased to see their king emerging, even slightly, from the long shadow of grief that had settled over him since his wife's passing. Others were far less generous in their assessment, particularly a handful of ambitious pack members who had spent the past 3 years quietly positioning themselves and their families closer to the king's favor, hoping perhaps for eventual influence over young Kaelin's future should Draven never remarry. One such figure, a well-connected pack elder named Halden, took it upon himself to voice these concerns directly to Corwin, cornering the advisor one evening in a quiet corridor of the packhouse. "This woman appears from nowhere," Halden said, his voice low but insistent, "with no family, no history, no claim to anything beyond a chance encounter with a frightened child. And now she dines with the king, receives his personal visits, is spoken of in the same breath as the young master's own mother. Does this not concern you, Corwin?" "It concerns me enough that I have looked into the matter thoroughly," Corwin replied carefully, unwilling to reveal the full extent of his own private doubts to a man whose motives were not entirely selfless. "I have found nothing to suggest she poses any danger to this pack." "Nothing you have found," Halden pressed, "does not mean nothing exists. She could be exactly what she claims, a simple woman fleeing hardship. Or she could be something far more calculated, using a child's innocent mistake to work her way into a position of influence she has no right to hold. Corwin did not entirely disagree with the possibility, though he had grown, over the weeks of quiet observation, less inclined to believe it likely. Still, he could not deny that Halden's concerns echoed some of his own earlier hesitations, and he promised, if only to end the conversation, to continue watching the situation carefully. The whispers, however, did not remain confined to the packhouse corridors for long. They spread outward through the territory, reaching farms and market stalls, reaching the ears of travelers passing through on their way to other lands, reaching, eventually, precisely the kind of attention Elara had spent months trying to avoid drawing toward herself. She received the first warning on a quiet evening, alone in her cottage, in the form of a folded note left tucked beneath her door while she had been out fetching water. She did not recognize the handwriting, and there was no signature, only a short, carefully worded message. He knows where you are. He is asking questions. Leave before he finds you himself. Elara read the note 3 times, before the full weight of its meaning settled over her, cold and sharp, cutting through the fragile sense of safety she had allowed herself to build over the past weeks. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the paper again, her mind racing through the implications, through the memories of Garrick's temper, his control, the desperate, careful plan that had allowed her to escape his territory in the first place. She spent that night pacing her small cottage, torn between the instinct to flee immediately, to disappear once more into some new territory where no one would think to look for her, and the unbearable thought of leaving without a single word to the boy who had come to trust her so completely, or to the man whose quiet kindness had begun to feel like something she was not ready to walk away from. By morning, exhaustion had worn her resolve thin enough that she nearly convinced herself the note was nothing more than an idle threat, perhaps even a cruel prank from someone within the territory, who resented the attention she had received. But the careful, deliberate wording of the message nagged at her throughout the day, refusing to be dismissed so easily. She considered, briefly, seeking out Draven immediately to share what she had received, but held back, uncertain how deeply she wished to entangle him in a danger that was entirely her own to carry. Instead, she began quietly preparing, gathering what few belongings she owned, considering routes she might take that would put enough distance between herself and the territory before anyone noticed her absence. It was Kaelin's visit 2 days later that finally broke through her careful planning. He arrived, as usual, full of energy and stories, this time excited about a new game he had learned from one of the stable hands, insisting she must learn it too before demonstrating it enthusiastically across her small kitchen floor. Elara watched him, her chest tight with an ache she had not expected to feel so sharply, knowing that whatever choice she made in the coming days would likely mean saying goodbye to him far sooner than either of them wanted. "You seem sad today," Kaelin observed suddenly, pausing mid-game, his sharp, childish perception catching her off guard. "I am only tired," she said, forcing a small smile. "Do not worry about me." He studied her for a long moment, with the serious, searching look children sometimes give adults when they sense something being hidden from them, but he did not press further, perhaps too young yet, to know how to ask the right questions, to uncover the full truth. That evening, after Kaelin and his escort had departed, Elara sat alone with her half-packed belongings scattered across her small table, staring at the folded note that had arrived 2 days earlier, still uncertain what path forward was truly the safest one to take. A second knock came at her door not long after, startling her enough that she nearly knocked over the candle beside her. When she opened it cautiously, she found not a stranger this time, but Ivy, the same young pack member who had brought her preserves weeks earlier, her expression troubled. "There was a man asking questions in the village today," Ivy said without preamble, clearly having rushed straight to Elara's cottage the moment she heard the news herself. "A stranger, not from our territory. He was asking about a woman matching your description, wanting to know exactly where she lived." Elara's stomach dropped, the careful, fragile hope she had been clinging to, that the warning note might have been nothing more than idle mischief crumbling entirely. "Did anyone tell him anything?" she asked, her voice tighter than she intended. "No one who spoke with him seemed to trust his intentions," Ivy said. "But it will not take much longer for him to find this cottage on his own, if that is truly what he is searching for. I thought you should know immediately." Elara thanked her quickly, her mind already racing through the same desperate calculations from days earlier. though now with far greater urgency. Ivy left soon after, promising to keep her ears open for any further news, leaving Alara alone once more, with the terrifying certainty that whatever safety she had found in this territory was rapidly slipping away from her. She spent that night finishing her preparations in earnest, resolved now to leave before dawn, to slip away quietly, the same way she had once slipped away from Garrick's territory months earlier, without goodbyes, without explanations, trusting only that distance and silence could once again keep her safe. But as she sat by her dying fire in the final hours before sunrise, her thoughts kept circling back to Kaelin's face, to his small hand gripping hers so tightly in the market square all those weeks ago, to the quiet, unspoken warmth that had grown steadily between herself and his father with each passing visit. Leaving without a word felt like the safest choice. It also felt, in a way she had not expected to feel so deeply, like it might be the greatest mistake of her life. She was still turning the decision over in her mind, torn between fear and something far harder to name, when the first hint of dawn light began creeping through her small window, and the sound of hurried footsteps approaching her door pulled her sharply from her thoughts. Her heart pounded as she rose quickly, reaching instinctively for the small kitchen knife she kept near the hearth, bracing herself for whatever threat might be standing on the other side of her door. But the voice that called out was not the voice of a stranger. "Alara, it is Draven." Relief and confusion tangled together as she set down the knife and pulled the door open, finding him standing there in the pale morning light, dressed as though he had left the pack house in a hurry, his expression unusually tense. "Ivy came to me last night," he said, before she could ask why he had arrived so early or so unannounced. "She told me what she learned in the village. Why did you not send word to me yourself?" Alara stepped back to allow him inside, her half-packed belongings still scattered visibly across her small table, evidence of her intentions that she had no way of hiding now. Draven's eyes moved over the scene quickly, understanding settling across his features. "You were leaving," he said quietly, "without telling anyone. I did not want to bring this danger any closer to your household than it already might be," Alara admitted, her voice tight with exhaustion and unshed emotion. "This is not your burden to carry, Draven. It never should have become entangled with your family at all." "It became entangled the moment my son grabbed your hand in that square," Draven said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I made my choice that day, Alara, when I chose silence instead of correction. I will not undo that choice now simply because danger has finally caught up to the reason I made it." Alara shook her head, frustration and fear mixing together in her voice. "You do not understand what you are offering to stand against. The man searching for me is not someone who accepts refusal easily. He will not simply walk away because a king asks him to." "Then tell me who he is," Draven said, his voice steady, despite the urgency beneath it. "Tell me everything, Alara. I cannot protect you, or my son, from a danger I do not fully understand." The demand, gentle as it was, finally broke through the careful walls she had maintained since the day they first met. She sank slowly into the chair beside her half-packed belongings, her hands trembling slightly as she began to speak, the words coming haltingly at first, before spilling out more freely. She told him of Garrick, of the territory she had once called home, before it became a place of constant fear and control, of the years spent learning to make herself small and unnoticeable, simply to avoid drawing his temper toward her. She told him of the night she finally found the courage to leave, slipping away under cover of darkness, with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a desperate hope that distance alone might be enough to keep her safe. Draven listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail she shared, though his anger, she could tell, was directed entirely outward, toward the man who had caused her such suffering, rather than toward her for having kept the truth hidden for so long. "He found rumors of me here," she finished quietly. "A stranger was asking questions in the village yesterday. I received a warning 2 days ago, telling me to leave, before he found me himself. I do not know if that stranger was truly Garrick's man, but I cannot risk waiting to find out." Draven was quiet for a long moment after she finished, his jaw tight, his hands clenched slightly at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, though something fierce burned steadily beneath it. "You will not run from this alone," he said. "Not anymore." "Draven." "Let me finish," he said, and something in his tone made her fall silent, watching him carefully as he seemed to gather his thoughts before continuing. I allowed you to stay in my home that first night for reasons I did not fully understand myself at the time. I told myself it was for my son's sake, that I was simply grateful for whatever comfort you had given him. After years of watching him struggle silently with grief, he was too young to fully carry. He paused, his eyes meeting hers directly now, unwavering despite the vulnerability clearly present in his expression. But it was never only for his sake, he continued. I let the mistake stand in that square, because for the first time in 3 years, I saw my son smile, without effort, without forcing it for my benefit. And in watching that, I found myself wanting, for the first time since my wife's passing, to stop carrying my own grief entirely alone as well. Alara's breath caught, her heart racing now for reasons entirely separate from the fear that had consumed her only moments earlier. Draven, I do not know what to say to that. You do not need to say anything yet, he said gently. I am not asking you to replace anyone, Alara. Not my wife, not anything you cannot freely choose to become. I am asking you to stay, not as a mistake corrected too late, and not simply for my son's benefit. I am asking you to stay as yourself, and to let me stand beside you against whatever danger has followed you here, rather than letting you face it alone. The sincerity in his words, the careful vulnerability he had clearly not allowed himself to express to anyone in a very long time, settled over Alara with a weight she found herself unable to resist any longer. She had spent months building walls precisely to avoid this kind of entanglement, precisely to avoid becoming important enough to anyone that her past might once again catch up to consequences she could not control. And yet here she was, undone entirely by a king's quiet honesty and a small boy's unwavering trust, unable to summon the will to walk away from either of them, even with danger looming closer with each passing hour. If I stay, she said slowly, you must understand that this danger is real. Garrick will not simply accept my refusal quietly. If he comes here, there may be consequences far beyond a difficult conversation. I have faced difficult consequences before, Draven said, his voice steady with quiet conviction. I did not become Alpha King by avoiding conflict when it mattered most. If he comes here believing he can simply take you back by force or by manipulation of old agreements, he will find that this territory does not bend so easily to outside demands. Alara studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any hint of hesitation, and finding none. Whatever fear still lingered within her about the danger Garrick represented, she found herself steadied, if only slightly, by the certainty in Draven's resolve. Then I will stay, she said finally, the words feeling both terrifying and strangely freeing as she spoke them aloud. For now, and we will face whatever comes together. Draven's shoulders eased slightly at her answer, though the tension around his eyes remained, clearly aware that the true test of his resolve had not yet arrived. Thank you, he said simply. I will have guards stationed near your cottage immediately, and I will send word throughout the territory that any strangers asking questions about your whereabouts are to be reported directly to me. He left shortly after to begin making the necessary arrangements, and Alara stood alone in her cottage once more, staring at her half-packed belongings scattered across the table, the weight of the choice she had just made settling slowly over her. She had come to this territory seeking nothing more than quiet anonymity, a small, unremarkable life, far removed from the fear and control that had once defined her existence. Instead, she had found a frightened child's trusting hand, a grieving king's quiet honesty, and now, standing at the edge of a danger she had spent months running from, a choice to stay and fight rather than disappear once more into the shadows. Whatever came next, she understood now that there would be no easy path forward, no simple resolution that did not require confronting, directly and without further hiding, the very past she had worked so hard to leave behind. The guards arrived at her cottage within hours, stationed quietly but visibly enough along the surrounding paths that anyone approaching would immediately understand this small home was no longer unprotected. Alara found herself grateful for their presence, even as the sight of them served as a constant reminder of exactly how real the danger she had confessed to Draven truly was. 3 days passed in tense, watchful quiet, each morning bringing a fresh wave of uncertainty about whether that day would be the one Garrick finally arrived. Kaelin's visits continued during this time, though Draven insisted on accompanying him personally now, rather than sending him with only guards, and Alara noticed the careful way he positioned himself near the windows during these visits, watching the path beyond with quiet vigilance, even as he engaged warmly with his son's endless chatter. On the fourth day, word finally reached the pack house that a group of strangers had been spotted approaching the territory's northern border, moving with the deliberate confidence of visitors who expected to be received rather than questioned. Corwin brought the news to Draven immediately, his expression grim. "Their leader identifies himself as Garrick," Corwin said. "He claims diplomatic purpose and requests an audience with you directly, my king." Draven's expression hardened at the confirmation, though he had half expected this moment since the day Alara first confessed the full truth of her past to him. "Bring him to the main hall," he said, "but ensure Alara remains within the pack house, away from any direct view of the gathering. I will not have him lay eyes on her again until I understand exactly what he intends to claim." The arrangements were made quickly, and by midday, Garrick arrived at the pack house with a modest but clearly capable escort of his own, his expression carrying the practiced calm of a man accustomed to getting precisely what he wanted, through careful negotiation, rather than open conflict. He was received in the main hall with the formal courtesy expected between alphas of neighboring territories, though the tension beneath the polite exchange of greetings was evident to everyone present. Draven remained seated upon his throne, his posture deliberately relaxed despite the sharp attention in his eyes, while Garrick stood before him with the confident ease of someone who believed he held every advantage in the conversation about to unfold. "I understand you have been hosting a woman in your territory," Garrick began, once the formalities had concluded. "A woman who once belonged to my pack, under obligations she abandoned without proper release. I am not aware of any woman in my territory belonging to anyone against her own will," Draven replied evenly, his tone giving away nothing of the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. Garrick's smile did not waver, though something colder flickered briefly behind his eyes. "There is an old agreement, my king, one perhaps unfamiliar to territories as young and settled as your own, a binding accepted freely by her family generations ago, tying certain lines of her bloodline to service within my pack. She left without formal release from that binding. By old law, she remains obligated to return." Corwin, standing nearby, stiffened visibly at the mention of the old agreement, clearly recognizing the reference, even if Draven himself did not immediately place it. Draven's eyes flicked briefly toward his advisor, before returning to Garrick. "Explain this old law in full," Draven said. "I will not act on a claim I do not fully understand." Garrick explained, with practiced patience, the details of an ancient binding agreement, one that had fallen out of common use across most territories, generations earlier, but remained technically unrevoked in a handful of older pack laws. It was, by his account, a legal claim rather than a personal grievance, a matter of obligation rather than force, though the careful way he framed the explanation did nothing to disguise the controlling intent Alara had already described to Draven in painful detail. "And if she refuses to honor this obligation," Draven said once Garrick finished, "what recourse does your claim provide?" "The law is clear," Garrick said. "Refusal by the bound individual, once formally confronted, permits the claiming pack to enforce return through whatever means necessary, so long as it does not violate the broader treaties between territories. I would prefer, of course, that this matter be resolved peacefully. It would reflect poorly on both our territories otherwise." The threat, thinly veiled behind formal language, was unmistakable to everyone present. Draven's hands tightened slightly against the arms of his throne, though his expression remained carefully composed. "I will need time to review the validity of this claim," he said finally. "Such matters require careful confirmation before any action can be taken, particularly given how rarely such old laws are invoked in modern times." Garrick inclined his head slightly, though his patience seemed calculated rather than genuine. "Of course, I understand the need for diligence. I will remain within your territory's guest quarters while you conduct your review. I trust a king as thorough as yourself will not take longer than necessary to reach the correct conclusion." The dismissal was polite on the surface, though the pressure behind it was evident to everyone in the room. Once Garrick and his escort had been led away to guest quarters under careful watch, Draven turned immediately to Corwin. "Is there truth to this old law?" he demanded. Corwin's expression was troubled as he answered. "There was once such a binding, recognized among older packs, my king, generations ago. before more modern treaties replaced such practices. Whether it remains technically enforceable depends entirely on whether it was ever formally revoked between his pack and hers. Given how rarely it is invoked now, records may be incomplete or difficult to verify quickly. Then we verify quickly, Draven said, his tone leaving no room for delay. I want every available record searched immediately. I will not allow a manipulated technicality to hand that woman over to a man who has clearly already caused her tremendous harm. Corwin bowed and hurried off to begin the search, leaving Draven alone with the full weight of the situation pressing down on him. He found Alara a short while later, waiting anxiously in a private chamber, where she had been kept away from Garrick's arrival, her expression tight with fear the moment she saw his face. "He is here," she said, though it was less a question than a confirmation of what she had already guessed from the tense atmosphere throughout the pack house. "He is," Draven confirmed. "He claims an old binding agreement ties your family line to service within his pack, one you never formally had released before leaving." Alara's face paled further, her hands trembling slightly as the full weight of the claim settled over her. "It is true that such an agreement existed generations ago within my family," she admitted, "but it was never meant to be used this way. It was symbolic, ceremonial, long since ignored by most who knew of it. He is twisting old words to justify what he wants, nothing more." "That is precisely what I intend to prove," Draven said firmly. "Corwin is searching every available record now to confirm whether the binding was ever formally revoked between our territories' historical treaties. I will not allow him to simply claim you through manipulated technicality, Alara, not while I have breath left to fight it." Despite his firm reassurance, fear continued to grip her tightly, memories of Garrick's control rising sharply to the surface now that he was, once again, standing within reach of reclaiming power over her life. "He will not stop with legal arguments if those fail him," she warned quietly. "I know him, Draven. He has never accepted refusal gracefully." "Then we will be ready for whatever comes after," Draven said, his voice steady, despite the storm clearly building behind his calm exterior. "But I need you to trust me, Alara. Whatever happens next, I will not let him take you from this territory against your will." She nodded slowly, though the fear in her eyes remained, and Draven found himself wishing, more fiercely than he had wished for anything in a very long time, that he could simply erase the danger standing within his own walls entirely, rather than fighting it through the slow, uncertain process of old records and formal negotiations. Outside, unseen by either of them, Garrick stood near the window of his guest chamber, watching the packhouse grounds below, with the patient calculation of a man who had already begun considering what steps he would take, should Draven's review, as he fully expected, fail to produce the outcome he desired. Corwin returned late that evening, his expression a careful mixture of relief and continued caution as he presented his findings to Draven in the privacy of his study. The binding was formally addressed within a treaty signed between the two territories nearly 40 years ago, he explained, laying out several aged documents across the desk. "It states clearly that such ceremonial family obligations were dissolved entirely upon that treaty's signing, replaced by modern agreements that carry no claim over individual descendants." Relief flooded through Draven at the confirmation, though it was quickly tempered by the understanding that Garrick was unlikely to simply accept defeat gracefully, once presented with evidence that dismantled his claim entirely. "Prepare copies of these documents," he instructed. "I want them ready to present the moment I call Garrick before me again." The confrontation came the following morning, in the same main hall where Garrick had first presented his claim, though this time, the atmosphere carried a far sharper edge of tension than before. Draven presented the aged treaty documents plainly, allowing Garrick's own advisors, who had accompanied him, to examine the records themselves and confirm their authenticity. Garrick's composed expression finally cracked slightly as he read through the documents, his jaw tightening as he realized the careful legal foundation of his claim had crumbled entirely beneath him. "This changes nothing regarding her personal debt to me," he said finally, abandoning the pretense of legal obligation now that it no longer served him. "She left in the middle of the night, without word, without any consideration for the position it placed me in among my own pack." "She left because she was afraid," Draven said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge now that the formal negotiations had clearly failed to achieve what Garrick truly wanted. "And judging by everything I have learned since her arrival here, that fear was entirely justified." Garrick's expression darkened, any remaining pretense of diplomatic calm evaporating entirely. You do not know what you are interfering with, King Draven. This is not a matter that concerns you or your territory. She belongs to me, whether by old law or simple truth. I suggest you reconsider your involvement before it costs you more than you are prepared to lose. The threat, spoken openly now without any attempt at disguise, drew immediate tension through the hall, guards on both sides shifting subtly into more alert positions. Draven rose slowly from his throne, his presence filling the space with the unmistakable authority of an Alpha King standing firmly upon his own territory. She belongs to no one, Draven said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. Not to you, not to old laws long since dissolved, not to anyone who seeks to claim her against her own will. As Alpha King of this territory, I am granting her formal sanctuary, effective immediately, protected under my authority and the full strength of this pack. The declaration, formal and absolute, left no room for further negotiation. Garrick's expression twisted with barely restrained fury, his hands clenching at his sides as the reality of his failed claim settled fully over him. You would risk conflict between our territories over a woman who is nothing to you, beyond a passing fascination, he demanded. I would risk far more than that, Draven replied evenly, to ensure no one within reach of my protection is handed over to someone who has already caused them such clear and lasting harm. For a tense, charged moment, it seemed the confrontation might spill into open conflict, Garrick's escort shifting closer around him, the pack's own guards tensing in immediate response. But Garrick, whatever his fury, was not foolish enough to believe he could win a direct confrontation deep within enemy territory, surrounded by a pack fully loyal to its king. This is not finished, Garrick said finally, his voice low with barely controlled anger as he turned to leave. Territories remember slights such as this one, King Draven. You have made an enemy today that you may come to regret. I have made a choice I do not regret at all, Draven replied calmly, watching as Garrick and his escort were led firmly from the hall, the failed claim leaving nothing further to hold him within the territory's borders. Word of the confrontation spread through the packhouse and beyond. Within hours, the formal declaration of sanctuary, carrying weight that even the most skeptical pack elders could not easily dismiss. Halden, who had voiced his concerns so pointedly to Corwin weeks earlier, found himself notably quiet in the days following, the clear danger Alara had faced softening even his earlier doubts about her presence within the territory. Alara herself received the news of the confrontation from Draven directly, relief and disbelief mixing together as he described the failed claim and the formal sanctuary he had declared on her behalf. You did not have to risk conflict with an entire territory for my sake, she said quietly, still struggling to fully absorb the weight of what he had done. I told you I would not let him take you from here against your will, Draven said simply. I meant every word of that promise. Despite the relief of the confrontation's resolution, unease lingered in the days that followed, Garrick's parting threat hanging heavily over the territory, even as guards remained stationed carefully along the borders, in case his anger translated into further action. But as the days passed without incident, the immediate danger slowly began to feel more distant, the sanctuary Draven had declared standing firm and unchallenged. Kaelin, unaware of the full details of the danger that had passed so close to the woman he had grown to adore, simply noticed that Alara seemed lighter after that week, her smiles coming more easily, her shoulders less tense during their visits together. He did not ask questions about the guards stationed near her cottage, nor about the tension he had briefly sensed within the packhouse during Garrick's brief presence. He simply continued visiting, continued sharing his small treasures and endless stories, content in the simple, growing certainty that Alara was not going anywhere. For Draven, the confrontation had clarified something he had been circling around carefully for weeks, unwilling to name it fully even to himself. He had risked conflict, reputation, and the careful political balance between territories, not out of simple obligation to a woman who had comforted his grieving son, but because somewhere in the quiet weeks since that first mistaken word in the market square, his feelings toward Alara had grown into something far more significant than he had initially allowed himself to acknowledge. He found her in her small garden one evening, not long after the danger had finally begun to feel settled, tending to a row of herbs with the same careful, quiet focus she brought to everything she did. She looked up as he approached, offering a small, genuine smile that had grown more natural with each passing week since they first met. I owe you more than I can easily express, she said, rising to meet him, for everything you have risked on my behalf. You owe me nothing, Draven said. I did not act out of obligation, Elara. I acted because the thought of losing you from this territory, from my son's life, from my own life, was simply not something I was willing to accept. The words hung between them, carrying a weight. Neither of them had allowed themselves to speak so plainly before. Alara's breath caught slightly, her earlier fear giving way now to something far warmer, far more uncertain in the best possible way. I did not expect to find anything like this here, she admitted quietly. I came to this territory seeking only safety, only quiet. I never expected to find a family I was not looking for. Nor did I expect to find myself capable of feeling this way again, Draven admitted, stepping closer. But I am grateful, more than I know how to properly say, that a small mistake in a crowded market brought you into our lives. Whatever words might have followed remained unspoken for the moment, interrupted by the sound of Kaylin's excited voice calling from further down the garden path, eager to share some new discovery with both of them. But the quiet understanding that had settled between Draven and Elara in that moment remained, steady and unshaken, a foundation upon which something lasting had clearly, finally, begun to grow. Months passed, and the territory settled slowly into a new rhythm, one that no longer carried the shadow of Garrick's threat hanging over it quite so heavily. Reports occasionally reached Draven of tensions within Garrick's own pack, whispers that his failed attempt to reclaim Elara had cost him standing among his own people, who had grown weary of his controlling temper long before his humiliation before a neighboring king. Whatever anger he still carried, he made no further move against the territory, and slowly, cautiously, the guards stationed near Elara's cottage were reduced, then eventually removed entirely, as the danger that had once felt so immediate faded into simple, distant memory. Elara no longer lived in the small cottage at the edge of the territory by then. She had moved, gradually and without any single dramatic moment marking the change, into the pack house itself, first as an honored guest, whose presence had simply become expected, and later as something far more permanent, a fixture within the household that no one, not even Halden and his once vocal doubts, thought to question any longer. The pack itself had changed too, in quieter ways that were nonetheless deeply felt by everyone within it. The heavy silence that had settled over the pack house since the loss of Draven's first wife had lifted gradually, replaced by something lighter, something that allowed laughter to return to rooms that had grown accustomed to quiet grief. Servants no longer walked the corridors with the careful, muted steps of people afraid to disturb a king lost in sorrow. Guards no longer exchanged worried glances when Kaylin's name was mentioned, uncertain whether joy or grief would follow. Kaylin himself had grown taller in the months since that chaotic afternoon in the market square, his fear of losing sight of people he loved softening gradually into simple, secure trust. He no longer flinched at loud crowds, no longer clung quite so desperately to hands that might disappear if he looked away for even a moment. He had, slowly and surely, begun to heal in ways that years of careful, well-meaning handling by healers and nursemaids had never quite managed to achieve. On a bright afternoon marking nearly a year since that first mistaken word had been spoken in the crowded market square, the pack gathered in the very same square once more, though this time for an entirely different purpose. Draven stood before his assembled people, Elara beside him, both dressed in the formal attire reserved for occasions the pack considered worthy of true celebration. Kaylin stood between them, older now, steadier, his earlier fear replaced entirely by open, unguarded joy. When Draven turned to him, asking formally, before the entire gathered pack, whether he welcomed Elara fully into their family, not simply as a guest, or a comfort during difficult days, but as something lasting and true, Kaylin did not hesitate for even a moment. He looked up at Elara, his small hand once again finding hers, though this time, there was no fear driving the gesture, only certainty. "Mother," he said clearly, deliberately, the word carrying none of the panicked instinct that had accompanied it the first time he spoke it, but instead the full, considered weight of a child choosing, with complete understanding, exactly what he wanted this woman to be in his life. The word rippled through the gathered crowd, carrying an entirely different weight than it had a year earlier, where once it had drawn startled silence and uncertain whispers, now it drew warmth, quiet smiles, even a few gentle tears from those among the pack, who remembered clearly how far their king and his son had traveled since that chaotic, uncertain afternoon. Draven, watching his son speak the words so deliberately, felt something settle fully within his chest, a peace he had not believed himself capable of feeling again, after the loss that had once threatened to define the rest of his life. He turned to Alara, taking her hand gently in his own, his expression carrying none of the careful, guarded silence that had marked their earliest days together. "A year ago, I said nothing when my son called you by a name that was not yours to claim," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet square, addressed as much to the gathered pack as to Alara herself. "I said nothing because some part of me already understood, even then, that it was not truly a mistake at all. It was the beginning of something I did not yet have the courage to name." He paused, drawing a steadying breath before continuing. "I have that courage now," he said. "Alara, you arrived in this territory seeking only safety, only quiet, expecting nothing more from us than a life left undisturbed. Instead, you gave my son laughter he had lost, gave this pack warmth that had been missing, and gave me a reason to believe that grief does not have to be the only thing left standing at the end of loss." The square had grown fully silent now, every eye fixed on the small scene unfolding at its center, the same location where an entire year of change had first, unexpectedly, begun. "I love you," Draven said simply, the words carrying none of the formal weight expected of a king's declaration, but instead the plain, honest sincerity of a man who had finally allowed himself to feel something he once believed lost to him forever. "Not as a replacement for anything, and not simply because my son adores you, though he certainly does. I love you because of who you are, entirely and completely, and I am asking you, before everyone gathered here who has watched this past year unfold, to stay with us, not temporarily, not cautiously, but fully, and always." Alara, tears gathering unashamedly in her eyes now, looked between Draven and Kaelin, both watching her with matching expressions of hopeful, open love, and felt the last remaining walls she had carried since fleeing her old life finally, fully, come down. "I came here running from everything I feared," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the emotion thickening it. "I never expected to find a home instead, but that is exactly what you have given me, both of you, and I choose this, fully and without hesitation. I choose to stay." The pack erupted into warm, genuine celebration at her answer, the square filling with sound, entirely different from the panicked shouting and worried whispers that had once accompanied a lost, frightened child calling a stranger by the wrong name. Kaelin, grinning widely, threw his arms around both of them at once, laughing freely, in a way that had once seemed impossible to imagine within these walls. As the celebration continued around them, Draven drew Alara close, his forehead resting gently against hers, the quiet, private moment carrying more meaning than any formal declaration could fully capture. "What began as a mistake," he murmured softly, "became the truest thing I have ever known." "It was never truly a mistake," Alara answered, smiling through her tears as she glanced down at Kaelin, still laughing between them. "Some things simply arrive before we understand them fully. I think, perhaps, some part of him knew exactly what he needed, long before any of us caught up to it." Overhead, the autumn sky stretched wide and clear above the market square, the same sky that had witnessed a frightened child's desperate mistake exactly 1 year earlier. But where that day had begun, in panic and uncertainty, this one closed in warmth, laughter, and the quiet, unshakable certainty of a family, finally, fully whole. And within the walls of the pack house that had once known only silence and careful guarded grief, laughter now echoed freely through every corridor, carried forward by a king who had finally learned to speak his heart aloud, a boy who had found, against every expectation, exactly the mother he needed, and a woman who had come seeking only safety, and found instead a love strong enough to call, without any hesitation at all, truly and completely her own.